Hello everybody, welcome back to the van build adventure with me, your purveyor of van-based buffoonery, Confluence aka Krishan. Today we're talking about a bit of a jumble sale of things, but it's all to do with the front bulkhead covering it with like the cladding and stuff, and also building some electrical boxes and making a pocket and yeah, a little bit of wiring, you know, just it's all part of the fun. Have a little bit of this in there, a little bit of that, who knows what else, I don't know mate, we'll just get on with it, aren't we? We're just going to do that, yeah, that's fine. So yeah, first up was just doing the last bit of insulation for the very bottom of the bulkhead, which I'd left out because I still hadn't figured out what I was doing with the D+. Go back to episode 13 to see how that worked out. But yeah, everything was cool and ready now. I could kind of set the cables in the right place and stick some 50mm Kingspan in front of it, and then just stuck it in place with a little bit of spray foam along the top, just a little tickle. It kind of was held in place by the floor and the supporting wood above it, so spray foam wasn't super necessary, but always nice to feel like it's a little bit more securely in place. And then it was pretty much just a case of putting the cladding across the top. All of them except for the one on the very far end needed to be the same length, so that kind of made things a little bit easier. I could just sort of stack them up and cut two at a time and not really have to worry about it. But in typical making this up as I go along fashion, once I got about halfway down, I sort of realised that the box that was going to house two 12-volt sockets and a USB socket pair kind of needed to be figured out a little bit, or I wanted to figure it out before I kind of accidentally did something with the cladding that was going to get in the way. As it happened, the lower cladding didn't really interfere with that, but the upper bit would have. So I started building this box, and I realised quite quickly that the angle on the side of the cables coming out of the wall meant that I was going to have to bring the box out quite far from the wall in order for there not to be a lot of strain on the connections or the cable. I think the connections are probably the bit to worry about. So I kind of measured this up and figured out how far it was going to be, and yeah, it stuck out pretty far, and sort of started cobbling a box together. The box consisted of upright supports coming from the horizontal support that I had that's kind of created the channel for the conduit, and ply kind of attached to the side of it and the top, and the bottom was left open, so it was a bit of a not quite box really, and it was a little is a little bit sketchy because it was only attached in that one place. It had a bit of a wobble to it, was not very secure, not so good for putting things on, i.e. as a shelf, or for leaning on, as my mum accidentally did at one point. I thought we'd actually screwed it, but we didn't. It was okay. It actually gained some stability once the cladding was put on top of it. But yeah, I mean, it came together okay, and I punched out some holes with my hole saw. They were a little bit bigger than those specified for the 12-volt sockets and the USB sockets. They're the same style. I think the holes were meant to be 28mm and I used 32, and they were too big, but thankfully you kind of screw the back on, so if you hold it at the right place, you do completely cover the hole and it's screwed and secured, so you never know that the hole was too big by looking at it, and it all works fine. And after the whole debacle with the lights from the last episode, there was no way that I was going to make the holes too small again. I would recommend erring slightly on the size of larger holes, although with the lights, if they were too big you wouldn't fit in, so the lights kind of need to be in the right size holes. But you know, for these things where you got screwy bits, it's sort of okay to have a little bit of wiggle room. I then went and got things wired up at the fuse box end. Luckily I mostly knew which cable was which from the conduit, because each one had the positive and negative 6mm cable for the 12-volt socket, and one of either the positive or negative for the USB socket, which I think only needed 2mm cables because it uses a lot less power, or is rated to a lot less. The 12-volt sockets are rated to 20 amps, which is quite a lot. I think you'll struggle to actually find something that will use that much power, but it's there if you need it. And honestly, the reason I put two 12-volt sockets in here at the front was not really because I expected to need them anytime soon. I didn't really have a planned use. It's actually more future-proofing, because they would be capable of hosting like a 12-volt USB-C adapter that could potentially power my laptop and save me from having to use my inverter some of the time. It was definitely a future-proofing decision. I did look for 12-volt USB-C sockets, just native ones, but weirdly they just don't seem to be a thing. I couldn't find any anywhere, which seems kind of crazy to me because USB-C is not exactly new at this point. But there you go. Maybe one day I'll replace them with native USB-C. I'm not sure. It seems like 12 volt auto type tech is quite far behind the times when it comes to regular technology, computery, phones, that kind of tech, which is a bit of a shame really. I wanted it to be a little bit more futuristic than it is, but there we go. I then popped the next bit of insulation in place, spray foamed it, and finished the cladding along the bottom. Again, pretty straightforward. The only interesting thing that I was doing, which I forgot to mention earlier, was that I was actually screwing behind the support at the bottom. So the cladding was here and then the support was running over the top, so I was screwing into it from the front. This was just to gain me a little bit of extra space, because why not? And it's sort of cool because it's let my desk kind of slot under the top one, as opposed to just losing that space entirely, but you still have the channel completely covered. Once I finished the bottom cladding and then did the other box, which is at the end, the door right behind me, and that was just housing a double USB socket and the light switch for the lights above the desk, which I can even demonstrate. Look at that, I'm in the dark, and well, it's not that dark, but it's lighter now. This one, I kind of learned some of the lessons, and it was a bit of a nicer spot than the previous box that went in the middle, so I did a bit of a better job of it. It could also sort of sit on top of the supports, kind of exactly in place of where it would be without actually fixing it, which was really handy while I was building it. I don't have full time lapses for the same reason as I lost time lapses for the previous X number of videos. The app was just randomly failing and just saving a picture instead of a time lapse. So you can mostly see me putting it together. It's again not a complete box because the rear of the box, the rear support and kind of rear wall of it is just the bits of the wall, the channel where the conduit is in. But I was a little bit better at realizing what size to remove from the build to account for the thickness of the ply, which is one of those things that just kept kind of catching me out whenever making boxes. I don't know, it just seemed to be a mistake that wouldn't really fully go in. I think I got a bit better at it with the very latest stuff that I did towards the end. Yeah, I did get a bit better at it, but I think I'm still tempted to make that class of error. I was also conscious with the design of this that I need to be able to take the front off easily, so I've got the front screwed on as like a separate piece that's not part of the structure at all. I then popped some holes in the front piece, again with the hole saw for the USB sockets, but for the light switch I used one of the smaller bits that kind of looks like the end of an arrow. I think it is just for making smaller holes than a hole saw would, although I do now have a set of hole saws that have really small hole saws. I don't really know what the difference is, but it was the right size and it looked great. The only problem was, although the end that you kind of screw onto looked quite long, turns out it wasn't quite long enough to go through 9mm ply and actually have any thread left to screw the other end onto to secure the light switch in place. So I had to get my Stanley knife out again and do some hacking on the opposite side where you wouldn't see it, to just kind of let the other end, the chunky bit of the light switch, sit into it a little bit more, to just stick through and have just enough thread that I could screw it on the other end. And that did work. It's only fallen off once, and luckily I noticed and screwed it back on again. At this point it occurred to me that it would make a lot of sense if I figured out what I was doing with the top up here above my desk, the top of the bulkhead, because I was aware that there was a bit of space that needed to be used somehow, or you know, could just be nothing, but it would be much more useful if it was some kind of storage. And there was the possibility of building a shelf, but because it had this like curved shape, like the bulkhead sort of curves like that, if you built a flat shelf you would get almost no space, or you'd have to bring the cladding on the bulkhead up quite a bit higher to actually have like a lip enough to keep things from falling out. So the shelf didn't seem a very good idea, but I think my mum suggested that what we could do as an alternative was make a pocket out of cloth, and this seemed like a really neat solution. I've not seen anyone do this, but then I've not really seen anyone do very much with the bulkhead anyway. It seems to be very usual to just take it out, although of course there are builds with a bulkhead. So we then went up to the loft and dug out some sort of old curtains, I think, for the base to do a sort of double layer. So there's just unpleasant random old white curtains on the bottom, and to kind of give it the full pocket. And then we used some fabric that has been around me my whole life, actually. It was on an armchair that I think belonged to my grandparents, and I always really loved that fabric, and my mum still had some hanging around, so I really liked the idea of having that in the van to kind of cover on top to look nice. So, you know, we tidied up there, cleaned it out to get ready to try and glue it on for the most part. So we used my good friend and gluing compadre, the Soudal Fixall Turbo, to stick it down in various places along the edge. We made a slight error in not sticking the seams down first, like in the middle, I think. But I don't think anything bad has happened because of that. I think it was more of like a perfectionist, we should have done this kind of mistake rather than an actually mattering mistake. And yeah, again, used the chemistry test books from my failed chemistry degree and a lot of random wood to kind of hold that in place while it all set, and then came back and basically did the same thing with the top layer. I know we did also use some staples as well, like where there was wood underneath we stapled, where there was metal we glued, but it was predominantly glued really. And it's been great. It was such a good idea. It stores, among other things, my 10 socket extension lead that runs to the back to the inverter, or to a mains extension if I'm at my mum's like I am now. And yeah, it's also got loads of other bits that would have really been hard to place anywhere else, and like duct tape, and I got a little place for my screwdriver. And yeah, it's honestly super helpful. It was a really great use of the space. Fully recommend a cloth pocket above your bulkhead, guys. I then went back to the wall cladding, as you do. Wall cladding, bulkhead cladding, I mean, it's now a wall. It's become a wall, we can call it a wall now. So it's a little bit more complicated than a little bit, because I had to account for a couple more things. Like, I knew that I was going to have the upper cupboards on the end, so I didn't need to make those end ones quite as high. And obviously in the middle I was going round the box that I had built for the electrical stuff. So yeah, a little bit more dynamic, but it was pretty much the same idea again. The interesting spot was probably putting in my speaker stands, which I really wanted to do now and not later, because I wouldn't know where the supports were later. Because as it happens, once you've covered something up with cladding, it's impossible to remember where anything is behind it with any degree of accuracy. Yeah, when we were doing the ply for the rear walls, I was really shocked at how difficult it was to figure out where the wood was behind it. So I knew that it needed to go in as I was doing it, where I could see for definite that I was putting the screws in the right place. And that all went fine in theory. I measured it up to make sure that it was going to be in a decent place. And I kind of tried to make them as high as possible, because I figured that you don't really lose that much by having them a bit too high. You can always point them down when you're sat down. But having them too low does make the sound quality not as good. When the speakers are much lower than your ears, you tend to lose a bit of the definition and the crispness of the stereo, and like the highs tend to feel like they've been muddied a bit. It's just not as nice. You want them as close to ear level as possible. What I forgot to account for though was that the upper cupboards on the right hand side were going to be in the way a little bit. So I actually did do them too high and had to move them at a later point when I realised this. But spoiler alert, it all went okay. I'll cover that properly when I actually get to it. Also, I had to finish with a couple of tiny pieces underneath the electrical box thingy, boxo sockets. It doesn't look great, but luckily it's covered by a monitor, so you can't really see the bit that's missing or any of that. It's kind of a neat solution. And yeah, that's about it really. I finished off the wall cladding and I had another wall, and it was really quite exciting. This is the wall that I look at the most, probably because I'm always just sat at my desk. Nerd! Oh yeah, one thing to note, I guess, because it's relevant here. The position, the height of my electrically box was picked because it would fit over my vary desk, which is basically a thing that you put on a desk so that you can switch it between being a normal desk and being a standing desk. What I didn't think about was the fact that with the box in the way, it wouldn't be able to be turned into a standing desk, rendering the whole thing redundant, which is why it's not in the van. I gave it to my friend Callum, and it's very happy there. I think he's looking after it. He's a very good adoptee for technology, and I think they're very happy together. So it's all okay. But I do miss having a standing desk. I still would like to implement something on the worktop, which is where the camera is currently placed. So, you know, gesturing in this direction doesn't really make very much sense. I would like to get a monitor on the wall so that I can kind of just bring my mouse and keyboard over here and put the laptop underneath and have a monitor and still have a standing desk set up. I kind of do miss that. It's not good for me to be sat at a computer for as long as I do. Standing is definitely better, but hey, that's a whole thing. Let's not get too deep into it now. Yeah, I tested the speakers out on the stands. They looked sexy and it was very exciting. It was the first bit of something that really felt like me, I guess, coming into the van. I spent a lot of time thinking about having my speakers in a van that I could take anywhere, and actually seeing them up on the wall was really cool. I think, yeah, the momentum at this point had really gathered, and it wasn't really hard anymore in the way that it had been to begin with. It was just exciting, and I just really wanted to get it done. But that's me for this one. It's got quite a lot of stuff in it already. I probably have already said too much, but thank you for watching anyway. If you enjoyed it or found it helpful, a like, comment, subscribe, those things are all magical and really do make me smile. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one. My potates. See you later, taters. Oh, soon will the men come to bring us sugar and tea.